People always say that the most dangerous thing in the world is a woman who has nothing left to lose. They're wrong. The most dangerous thing in the world is a woman who never had anything to begin with, and who spent 26 years watching everything she deserved get handed to someone else. My name is Chloe Sterling, and I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not asking for your sympathy. I stopped wanting sympathy a long time ago. What I want is for you to understand exactly how a girl who was raised to feel invisible became the most powerful person in the room that used to belong to her father. But let's start at the beginning, because the beginning matters. The beginning is where all the damage was done. I grew up in a house that most people would have called a dream. Our primary residence was a 12,000-square-foot limestone townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, 3 blocks from Central Park. My father, Richard Sterling, had acquired it in his late 30s as a symbol of everything he'd built. Sterling Global Enterprises, a real estate development and asset management firm that had reshaped the skylines of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut.
He had a summer estate out in the Hamptons, too, a sprawling 6-bedroom colonial with the pool that overlooked the Atlantic, where the sound of the ocean was so constant it became a kind of white noise you forgot was there. Most children would have been dazzled by all of it. I was terrified by it. Because the most important thing you need to know about that house is not the square footage or the address or the way the afternoon light fell through the cathedral windows in the main hall. The most important thing is that in all those rooms, in all that space, there was not a single square inch where I felt like I belonged. My mother's name was Diane. She died the day I was born, a postpartum hemorrhage, fast, catastrophic, unstoppable. The doctors tried everything. It didn't matter. She was 28 years old. She had been Richard Sterling's first and only great love, and she was gone before I ever took my second breath in this world. I know this because Mrs. Calloway told me. She was our housekeeper, a round-faced woman from County Cork with a heavy accent, and she was the closest thing to a mother I had for the first decade of my life. She would tell me about Diane in whispers when my father wasn't home. How she'd laughed, what perfume she wore, how she used to leave sticky notes with little drawings on the refrigerator just to make Richard smile. Mrs. Calloway kept a photograph of her tucked behind the spice rack in the kitchen, and sometimes, when I was very small, she would take it out and show it to me. I looked exactly like her. Same dark hair, same straight nose, same wide-set green eyes that people always called striking. When I was 4, I didn't understand why that was a problem. By the time I was 7, I understood perfectly. My father did not look at me the way fathers look at daughters. He looked at me the way a man looks at the scene of an accident, with a complicated mixture of grief and blame and the desperate wish that he could simply look away. I would walk into a room and watch his jaw tighten. I would say good morning and watch him set down his coffee cup with the careful precision of a man practicing control. He provided for me the way you might provide for an obligation: food, clothing, a private school education, a roof. He made sure I had the minimum required to function. What he never gave me was warmth, eye contact that lasted more than 3 seconds, a hug that didn't feel like a transaction. On my 6th birthday, Mrs. Calloway baked me a cake, chocolate with white frosting, and put 6 candles on it. My father was home that evening, which was unusual. He came into the kitchen while she was lighting the candles, looked at the scene for a long moment, and then said, very quietly, "I have calls to make," and walked back out. Mrs. Calloway and I ate the whole cake ourselves. She sang happy birthday twice, loudly, to make up for the silence. I didn't cry. Even then, I didn't cry. I think some part of me had already begun building the walls. The Hamptons house was worse in some ways, because it was smaller, more contained, and there was no escaping him there. I remember one summer when I was 8, I found an old photo album in the library there, buried on a bottom shelf behind a stack of architectural magazines. It was full of pictures of my parents, Wedding pictures, vacation pictures, a photograph of my mother in a yellow sundress standing on the beach right outside that house, laughing at something off camera with her whole face. She looked radiant. She looked alive. I sat on the floor of that library for 2 hours looking at every single page. When my father found me, I watched the color drain from his face. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he took the album from my hands, carefully, like it was fragile, like I might damage it simply by touching it, and he put it back on the shelf. He looked down at me, and for just a moment his expression cracked into something that wasn't quite hatred and wasn't quite grief, and was somehow worse than either. Then he said, "Don't come in here," and left the room. I never went in that library again. Then, when I was 10 years old, my father married Evelyn Hartwell. I remember the morning he told me about her. He called me into his home office, a room I was almost never invited into, and sat behind his enormous mahogany desk like he was about to conduct a business meeting. He was wearing a suit, which struck me as strange for a Saturday morning. He told me he was remarrying. He told me her name. He told me she had 2 children from a previous marriage, Julian, who was 9, and Harper, who was 6, same as me. He told me they would be moving into the townhouse. He told me to be polite and to stay out of the way. He did not ask me how I felt. He did not tell me it was going to be okay. He simply stated the facts and dismissed me. I walked back upstairs to my room and sat on my bed for a long time, looking at the ceiling. Evelyn arrived 3 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, in a black town car with Julian and Harper and 17 pieces of matching luggage in a shade of blush pink. I was watching from the upstairs hallway through the iron railing. I watched my father come out of his office, something he never did when I came home from school, and meet them in the foyer. And then I watched something I had never seen before in that house. He smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and changed the whole shape of his face. He picked up Harper, this tiny blonde girl with pigtails and enormous blue eyes, and spun her around, and she laughed, and he laughed, and for one strange, vertiginous moment, I thought I was watching a stranger. Because that man in the foyer, warm and laughing and present, did not look anything like the man who had raised me. Evelyn was beautiful in a polished, deliberate way. Blonde, slender, expensively dressed, with a smile that always looked just slightly calculated. She was not cruel to me, I want to be honest about that. She was never mean. She was simply indifferent, in the specific way of someone who has correctly assessed that you are not relevant to her priorities. She would smile at me when we passed in the hallways. She would include me in dinner plans. She would occasionally ask me how school was going. But she never once looked at me the way she looked at Julian and Harper, as though the sun rose and set on their existence. And she looked at my father the way a woman looks at a man she has won. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it as an observation. Evelyn was strategic in the way that certain beautiful women learn to be strategic when they grow up without money and decide they will never be without it again. She had married up, and she intended to stay there. Within 6 months of their arrival, the house transformed. Evelyn redecorated the main floor in warmer tones, replaced the cold, formal furniture with things that looked livable, installed a chef's kitchen that actually smelled like food being cooked. Julian and Harper each got bedrooms redesigned by an interior decorator, Julian's with a basketball hoop and a custom-built gaming setup, Harper's like something out of a fairy tale, with a canopy bed and hand-painted murals on the walls. My bedroom stayed exactly as it had always been. A queen bed, a desk, white walls, gray carpet. Functional, adequate, invisible. For Harper's 7th birthday, Richard rented out the private event space at the plaza. There were 120 guests, a custom 3-tiered cake, a professional magician, and a pony, an actual pony brought in through the service entrance. I watched from across the room as my father knelt down next to Harper while she blew out her candles, and I watched him whisper something in her ear that made her dissolve into giggles. And I thought about my 6th birthday, and the chocolate cake, and the 2 of us eating it alone in the kitchen. I was 11 years old, and I made a decision that night, standing in the corner of that party with a glass of sparkling water in my hand and a pleasant, neutral expression. I was never going to ask him for anything again. Not his attention, not his approval, not his love, not his money. I was going to build something that made all of it irrelevant. I didn't know what yet. I was 11, but the seed was planted, deep and stubborn as a weed in concrete, and it never stopped growing. I taught myself to be a ghost in that house. I woke up early, left before the family breakfast, stayed late at school, came home after dinner was cleaned up. I got a library card and I used it compulsively. I read economics textbooks the way other girls read YA novels. I discovered Warren Buffett's shareholder letters at age 13 and read every single one. I took apart an old laptop Mrs. Calloway found at a garage sale and taught myself to reassemble it and then to program it, watching tutorials on YouTube until 2 in the morning when the rest of the house was quiet. Richard never asked what I was reading. He never asked what I was working on. He never asked about my grades, even when I graduated 8th grade as the top student in my class and the school sent a letter home. The letter sat on the kitchen counter for 3 days before Mrs. Calloway quietly put it on my desk. I never said a word about it. I just kept building, and I kept watching. I watched how my father ran his company, his phone calls, his dinner conversations with business partners, the way he talked about leverage and acquisition and market positioning. I watched, and I learned, and I filed everything away. Not because I planned to work for him. I planned to surpass him. I just didn't know the timeline yet. By the time I was 16, I was running a small freelance web design business under a pseudonym, charging small local businesses a few $100s per site. By 17, I had $5,000 in a savings account that Richard knew nothing about. By 18, I had $11,000. I was invisible in that house, but I was not idle. And invisibility, I would learn, has its advantages. Nobody watches a ghost. Nobody tracks what a ghost is building in the dark. They should have watched me. The summer I turned 22, I graduated from Columbia University with a dual degree in computer science and financial economics with a 3.97 GPA, a departmental award for academic excellence, and a job offer from a boutique quantitative finance firm in Midtown that I had earned entirely on my own, through 3 rounds of interviews and a technical assessment that their head of recruiting later told me was the highest scoring submission they'd received in 4 years. I want you to understand what it took to get there, because Richard did not pay for my education, not entirely. He paid the minimum he could justify, a contribution that covered about 40% of tuition, nothing else. No housing stipend, no book allowance, no meal plan top-up. He had set up a trust for Julian and Harper that would cover 4 years at any university they chose, all expenses included, with a quarterly allowance for personal spending. I knew this because Harper had mentioned it once at dinner, casually, the way you mention something that is simply the natural order of the world. I said nothing at dinner. I drove home that night to my off-campus apartment, a place I shared with 2 other girls, a railroad-style 2-bedroom in Morningside Heights, where the radiator clanked so loudly in winter, it was like living next to a construction site. And I sat at my desk and I opened my laptop and I looked at my budget spreadsheet, and I recalculated, again, exactly how many hours I needed to work that semester. I was working 3 jobs, an on-campus tutoring position for intro-level CS students, a weekend shift at a coffee shop 3 blocks from campus where I learned to make a perfect cortado and developed a deep, abiding love for the 6 a.m. quiet before the rush, and a remote data analysis contract with a small fintech startup that paid me $16 an hour and had first introduced me to the world of venture-backed technology companies. I was working, on average, 31 hours a week while carrying a full course load. There were semesters I slept 5 hours a night, sometimes 4. There were nights I fell asleep at my desk with my cheek on my keyboard and woke up to a screen full of the letter J. But I did it. I built something real, something that was entirely mine, and no one could touch it or take credit for it or diminish it. My GPA, my degree, my job offer. These things belonged to me in a way that nothing in that Upper East Side townhouse ever had. The evening of Richard Sterling's 60th birthday fell on a Friday in late September. He had been planning the gala for months. Evelyn had been planning it, really, with the obsessive precision she brought to all social events. The venue was the grand ballroom of a hotel in Midtown, a soaring space of gilded ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and circular tables that seated 12. 240 guests, a string quartet for cocktail hour, a live band for dinner, a custom menu developed with a James Beard Award-winning chef. The invitations had been custom engraved on heavy cream stock. I received mine in the mail, a professional gesture that told me everything about how my presence was regarded. I was on the list because leaving me off would have created a narrative. I was there as a placeholder, a box to check, a body in a chair at table 17, which I noted when I arrived was the table furthest from the stage. I wore a black dress I had bought for $48 at a consignment shop in the East Village and had it altered by the tailor on the ground floor of my building, who charged me $20 and did a near-perfect job. I did my own hair. I took the subway. The room was full of Richard's world. Real estate developers, finance executives, old money socialites in their jewels and their cultivated ease, people who had known Richard for decades and who greeted each other with the double cheek kiss of the permanently wealthy. Julian was there in a custom tuxedo, 21 years old, already working in his father's company in a role that had been created for him, already wearing the casual confidence of a man who has never once had to wonder whether he would be okay. Harper was there in a gown that, I later learned, had cost $4,000, 20 years old, a junior at NYU, luminous and laughing and completely, blissfully unaware of the architecture of the night. I took my seat at table 17. I drank water. I ate the food. I watched the room. The announcement came after dinner, during the speech portion of the evening. Richard's attorney, a compact, silver-haired man named Gerald Holt, who had been with the firm for 20 years, took the microphone first and offered a brief, formal tribute. Then Richard himself stood up to sustained applause that filled the room like a wave. He looked like a man at the height of his confidence that night. 60 years old, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, still carrying the physical authority of a man who had always been used to being the largest presence in the room. He smiled at the applause, let it roll over him, and then raised a hand for quiet. He talked about building Sterling Global Enterprises from a single brownstone acquisition in 1989 to a portfolio valued at over $800 million. He talked about legacy. He talked about family. And then he said he wanted to share something personal. A summary, he called it, of the plans he had made to ensure that everything he had built would endure. He talked about Julian first, his son, his pride, his legacy in human form. He talked about Harper, his brilliant daughter, his light. He described the provisions he had made, the transfer of controlling interests in Sterling Global Enterprises, the real estate portfolio, the trusts, the accounts, the estate in the Hamptons, the townhouse in Manhattan, everything, all of it, to Julian and Harper jointly, to be administered according to the terms of the trust he and Gerald had spent 2 years developing. I sat at table 17 with my hands in my lap and my face perfectly still, and I listened and I understood before he was finished. And then he looked across the room, directly at me, and said, "My daughter Chloe will receive her own understanding of this arrangement in private." The way he said, "my daughter," the slight pause before it, the almost imperceptible flattening of his voice, no one else in that room would have noticed. I noticed. He asked me to join him in the side room off the main hallway during the cocktail portion of the evening's second act. I stood up from table 17 and walked through that glittering, chandeliered room, and I could feel the eyes of the people who knew enough to be curious, and I kept my face like stone, like glass, like the surface of still water. The side room was a small parlor with 2 chairs and a low table. Richard was already there when I arrived. Gerald Holt stood near the door, his face professionally neutral. Richard waited until the door was closed. "You know what the arrangement is," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. "Then I'll be direct." He clasped his hands in front of him, a gesture I recognized, a gesture he used in business meetings when he was about to deliver terms that were not negotiable. "You will receive nothing from this estate. No assets, no interest in the company, no trust, no property, nothing." I said nothing. I breathed. "I want you to understand," he said, and his voice was steady and measured and cold in a way that was worse than anger. "This is not a legal oversight. It is a deliberate decision. You have been provided for. You have been educated. Your debt to this family is paid." "My debt," I said. The two words came out quiet, neutral. "You took something from me that I can never recover." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw it. The thing I had always seen in his face, the ancient, terrible thing that he had carried for 22 years and had never once tried to put down. "Your mother is gone because of the day you were born. I built everything in this room, everything in this company, everything in my life for a future I was supposed to share with her, and you are standing here because she is not. That is the truth. I will not pretend otherwise." The room was very quiet. "So no," he said, "you don't get my wealth. You took my wife. The accounts are even." I stood there in that small, immaculate room in my $48 dress, and I looked at my father, this man whose blood ran in my veins, whose name I carried, whose house I had haunted for 22 years and had never once tried to put down. I waited for the grief to come, the shattering thing, the thing that would crack me open, the way it would crack open anyone who was told, at 22 years old, clearly and without ambiguity, that they were worth nothing to the man who was supposed to love them most. It didn't come. What came instead was something I can only describe as a door closing, not with a slam, with a soft, precise, final click, like a lock engaging. I nodded once. "I understand," I said. "Good," he said, and he walked back to his party. I stood in that room alone for 45 seconds. I know it was 45 seconds because I counted. Then I picked up my clutch from the chair, walked through the corridor, through the gilded lobby of that Midtown hotel, and out through the revolving doors into the September rain. It was raining hard that night, the kind of New York rain that comes sideways, that turns umbrellas inside out and overwhelms the subway grates. I didn't have an umbrella. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the rain hit me. My $48 dress, my carefully done hair, all of it. And I felt the cold of it, and I felt the weight of the night, and I thought about my father's voice, the flatness of it, the way he said, "Your debt to this family is paid," like I was an account to be settled, a liability to be discharged. And then, standing in the rain on 54th Street, something happened inside me that I have never fully been able to explain. The last thread of something, some residual, vestigial hope, some child-shaped part of me that had spent 22 years waiting for him to see me, to choose me, to say I'm sorry. That thread snapped clean. Not with grief, with clarity. I was free. I had needed him to be my father. I no longer needed anything from him, and that meant that everything he had, everything he valued, everything he had built and protected and chosen over me, all of it was simply a target. I walked 3 blocks to the nearest subway entrance, went underground, and rode the 6 train back to Queens. I didn't cry on the train. I didn't cry when I got home. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and started writing a business plan. The Sterling family thought they had ended something that night. They had started something. My studio apartment in Astoria, Queens was 412 square feet. I measured it once, out of a specific desire to know exactly the dimensions of the world I was working inside. A Murphy bed that folded into the wall so I could use the floor space as a thinking space. A kitchen counter doubling as a desk. 3 monitors arranged in an L shape. 2 external hard drives in a small stack. A whiteboard I had installed on the back of the bathroom door because that was the only available vertical surface I hadn't already covered. The window faced an air shaft. In 6 years of living there, I watched the sun come through it exactly once, for about 11 minutes in late June. I want to tell you the apartment was romantic in some scrappy startup mythology kind of way. It wasn't. It was cramped and dim, and in winter, the gap under the front door let in a cold draft that no amount of weather stripping fully addressed. The radiator operated on its own schedule, unrelated to the outdoor temperature. My neighbor on the left kept a schedule that was the inverse of mine, which meant that just as I was achieving the kind of 3 a.m. mental clarity where the best work happens, he was coming home and cooking something that involved a great deal of banging. I lived on black coffee, overnight oats, and a rotating cast of the cheapest high-protein grocery options I could find. I had a budget, and I adhered to it with the devotion of a religious practice. Rent, utilities, groceries, internet, transportation. These were the line items. There was no category for anything else for the first year and a half. I took the job at the quantitative finance firm, Meridian Capital Partners, a 14-person shop that specialized in algorithmic trading strategies for institutional clients. I was the most junior person in the building by 4 years, and I was, within 8 months, writing code that their senior analysts were using in production. I want to be modest about this, but I also want to be honest. I was better at the technical side than most of them, and I had something they didn't, which was the specific, motivating fury of a person who has been told they are worth nothing and has decided to prove the universe wrong. I worked at Meridian from 7 in the morning until 6 in the evening. Then I went home and I worked on my own project until 2 or 3 in the morning. Then I slept. Then I did it again. The idea that became Aegis Holdings did not arrive as a single revelation. It arrived the way most real business ideas do, through the accumulated friction of watching an industry work inefficiently and thinking, every day, there is a better way to do this. What I was watching was the intersection of commercial real estate financing and institutional investment technology, the specific grinding inefficiency of how mid-market real estate developers accessed capital. The big players, the Richard Sterlings of the world, had established banking relationships, personal networks, the accumulated social capital of decades. Everyone else was working through a fragmented, opaque, relationship-dependent process that was slower and more expensive than it needed to be. I spent 18 months building, in my own time, a platform that used machine learning models to assess credit risk, asset value, and market positioning for commercial real estate deals, and to match those deals with a curated network of institutional investors in a fraction of the time a traditional broker relationship required. I called the platform Aegis, a name I chose deliberately from the Greek word for shield, because I intended it to be a fortress. The first person I showed it to was a woman named Dr. Patricia Yuen, a finance professor at NYU Stern, whom I had cold emailed after reading 3 of her published papers on alternative lending markets. I attached a 12-page executive summary. I said in the email that I wasn't looking for validation, I was looking for the strongest possible critique, and I would pay for her time. She responded in 48 hours and said the pay wasn't necessary, but she would meet with me. She tore apart my risk modeling in the first 20 minutes. I had anticipated 8 of her 10 critiques and had answers prepared. The other 2 I wrote down, thanked her for, and rebuilt over the following month. We met 4 more times. By the end of the 4th meeting, she said quietly, but without any ambiguity, "This is real. You need to take this to capital." I did not know how to talk to venture capitalists. I knew abstractly how funding rounds worked, how term sheets were structured, what VCs were looking for, but walking into a room full of men in expensive casual wear who had seen 1,000 pitches and whose default setting was skepticism, that was a different skill set than building financial models at 3 a.m. alone.
I learned it. I spent 60 days doing nothing but preparing. I recorded myself pitching on my laptop camera and watched the playback, brutal and unsparing, and identified every hesitation, every verbal tic, every moment where my body language telegraphed uncertainty. I eliminated them one by one. I researched every firm I was going to approach, their portfolio, their thesis, their partners' backgrounds, the specific language they used in their public writing. I prepared for every question I could conceive of, and 100 I hoped they wouldn't ask. The first 8 firms passed, some politely, some dismissively. One partner spent 40% of our meeting checking his phone, which I noted and used as fuel for approximately 6 months. The 9th firm was Harrington Ventures, a mid-sized fund with a specific thesis around financial infrastructure technology. The partner I met with was a woman named Sandra Okafor, 42, Yale MBA, former Goldman Sachs, with a directness I immediately respected. She asked me during our second meeting why she should bet on me specifically, not on the platform, on me. I looked at her across the conference table in her firm's offices on the 41st floor of a building in the financial district, and I said, because I have been building this with no resources, no network, no safety net, and no one to ask for help since I was 16 years old. I don't know how to stop, and I have a reason to win that is more durable than ambition. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me the reason." I told her enough. Not everything, but enough. Harrington Ventures led a $2.3 million seed round. It was the largest sum of money I had ever been responsible for, and I remember the morning the wire cleared into the Aegis operating account, sitting at my desk in the 412-square-foot apartment at 7 in the morning with a cup of coffee and feeling not elation, something quieter, more load-bearing than elation, confirmation, the proof that the thing I had been building in the dark was real. I hired 3 people in the first month, a back-end engineer named Marcus, who had previously built infrastructure at 2 successful fintech startups, a business development lead named Rena, who had spent 5 years at a commercial real estate brokerage and knew every pressure point in the process I was trying to fix, and a data scientist named Tom, who had a PhD from MIT and a willingness to work at a startup's salary that I suspected was connected to the fact that he genuinely loved the problem. I told all 3 of them in their first week, we are building something that will last. I need people who want to build, not people who want to be comfortable. None of them left in the first 2 years. That told me something. The first major client was a regional developer in Philadelphia named Castellan Development, who was trying to close a mixed-use project and had been stuck in traditional financing for 8 months. We ran their deal through the Aegis platform, matched them with 3 institutional investors within 6 weeks, and closed financing at a rate 40 basis points better than their bank had offered. Their CFO called afterward and said, "I don't know what you built, but I need to understand it better." And I spent an hour on the phone with him explaining it, because a satisfied client who understood the value was worth 20 cold call prospects. That call led to 4 referrals. Those referrals led to a pipeline. By the end of year 2, Aegis had processed 117 deals with a combined transaction value of over $900 million. We raised a Series A, $11 million, led by 2 new institutional investors and followed on by Harrington. I moved out of the Astoria apartment and into a 2-bedroom in Long Island City, which felt at the time like the most extravagant thing I had ever done. By year 4, we had processed over $3 billion in transactions and had expanded into London and Toronto. I raised a Series B at a post-money valuation of $220 million. I moved to a floor-through in Tribeca that I will admit I stood in for a full 10 minutes the first morning, just looking at the light. The actual natural light that came through the floor-to-ceiling windows and landed on the hardwood floors in long, clean rectangles. I had never, in my adult life, lived somewhere with real light. By year 6, Aegis was valued at just under $1 billion. I was 30 years old. By year 8, we were at $4.6 billion. I had become, in the language of the industry I operated in, a unicorn. I had also, in the language I used for myself, privately, at night when I sat at my desk in my Tribeca apartment and looked at the numbers, become untouchable. I never forgot why I built it. I never let myself forget. There were days, in year 3 especially, when a regulatory challenge threatened to derail our business model and I worked for 11 days straight without taking a full night's sleep, when I would think about quitting. And then I would think about a side room off a ballroom in Midtown Manhattan and a man in a suit telling me the accounts were even, and I would go back to work. I thought about Table 17 sometimes. I thought about the pony at Harper's birthday party. I thought about the library in the Hamptons with the photograph on the shelf. I thought about it all, and I built.
The thing about inherited wealth is that it confers advantages while simultaneously insulating recipients from the very skills required to maintain it. It is, in that way, a kind of long-term sabotage, a gift with a delayed detonator. I had understood this at 17, reading about the third-generation curse in a library book about family business succession, while Julian was at Exeter learning to ski in the Alps. I had been watching Sterling Global Enterprises for years by the time it started to visibly unravel. Not obsessively, I had a company of my own to run, a company that, by any objective measure, had eclipsed Sterling Global's value by the time Aegis crossed the $3 billion threshold. But I had set up quiet, comprehensive monitoring mechanisms. Market filings, commercial real estate data feeds, debt issuance records, property transfer databases in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. I had a complete, real-time picture of my father's company, and I watched it the way a scientist watches a long-anticipated experiment, with patience, with precision, and without attachment to a particular timeline. Julian Sterling became president of Sterling Global Enterprises at 24, in a transition my father announced with a press release that described him as visionary and a natural leader positioned to carry the Sterling legacy forward. I kept that press release. I printed it out and put it in a folder labeled simply Documentation. Julian was not visionary. Julian was charming in the way that certain men are charming who have never had to develop anything beyond charm, a surface-level social facility built on the foundation of good looks and the unshakable confidence of someone who has never been told no by anyone whose opinion he valued. He was genuinely likable in person. He was also, as a business operator, comprehensively out of his depth. His first major initiative, announced 18 months into his tenure, was an ambitious expansion into large-scale luxury residential development, a departure from the commercial asset management and mid-market development that had been the actual engine of Sterling Global's financial performance. He had been pitched the idea at a dinner party in the Hamptons by a developer friend and had apparently decided that this constituted sufficient due diligence. He committed $250 million, a combination of company capital and leveraged debt, on 3 luxury residential projects in markets that were at that precise moment beginning to show the early indicators of supply overload. I watched this from my desk in Tribeca with my coffee and my data feeds, and I thought about the press release about vision and leadership. Harper joined the company 2 years later with a title of Chief Brand Officer that had been created for her. Harper was in some ways sharper than Julian. She had a genuine aesthetic sensibility and a talent for the kind of cultivated social visibility that translated in modern real estate to press coverage and aspirational marketing. But she'd grown up in a world where the money was simply there, a fact of nature, and she operated accordingly. The company's marketing budget tripled under her direction. The events budget for a single quarter exceeded what I had paid myself in my first year at Meridian. The luxury residential projects hit problems in year 2 of development. Construction cost overruns, a softening market, a financing structure that had been assembled with optimistic assumptions about interest rates that subsequent Federal Reserve decisions made untenable. Julian's response was to throw more capital at the problem. He restructured the debt twice. He brought in a new CFO, a man named Prescott who had impressive credentials, and, I assessed from his public statements and the company's subsequent filings, a remarkable tolerance for optimistic projections. Richard was still nominally chairman, but he had been withdrawing from operational involvement for several years. He was 68 by this point, and there were quiet reports from people in his circle, reports that found their way to me through the interconnected intelligence network of the New York financial world, that his health was not what it had been. He played golf in the mornings, he attended board meetings, he trusted his son. The first public signal of serious distress came when Sterling Global failed to make a scheduled interest payment on $180 million commercial mortgage-backed security that was part of the leverage structure underlying Julian's residential expansion.
It was a missed payment of $11.4 million. In the context of an $800 million enterprise, $11 million is not catastrophic, but it is public. CMBS structures require disclosure, and in the specific, reputation-dependent world of New York real estate finance, a missed payment is not just a number, it is a story. And the story that gets attached to it determines whether you can refinance, renegotiate, survive. The story that attached to Sterling Global was not a good one. Julian's response to the press coverage was a statement that used the phrases temporary liquidity adjustment and strategic recalibration of our portfolio positioning in the same sentence, a combination that I can tell you from 10 years in the financial industry telegraphs to every sophisticated market observer exactly how deep the trouble actually is. Within 6 weeks of that statement, Sterling Global's remaining major institutional lender exercised a covenant default provision and accelerated repayments on $63 million of outstanding credit. The company did not have $63 million liquid. From my office on the 32nd floor of a building in Hudson Yards, Aegis had moved there the previous year. 6,000 square feet of clean, modern space with views of the river and a conference room I had named internally for Mrs. Calloway. I watched this sequence unfold on my screens with the calm of someone who has been watching a chess game for years and has just seen the opponent make the move that confirms the endgame. I had been preparing for this moment for 2 years, not hoping for it. I want to be precise about this. Hope is passive. What I had been doing was building the mechanism. I had spent that time through a series of holding entities structured through a Delaware LLC and a Cayman Islands intermediate vehicle, quietly and legally accumulating a position in Sterling Global's debt instruments and publicly traded preferred equity. The debt had been trading at a discount as the company's creditworthiness deteriorated, which meant I had been able to acquire, at below par value, a significant notional claim on the company's obligations. Nobody connected the purchasing entities to Chloe Sterling because there was no reason for anyone to look for that connection. I was Aegis Holdings. Aegis Holdings was technology and financial infrastructure. Nobody put Aegis in the same sentence as Sterling Global. That was intentional. By the time Julian made his strategic recalibration statement, I held through my various entities approximately 38% of the company's outstanding senior debt. I needed 51% to achieve the blocking position I was building toward. The acceleration of the $63 million credit facility forced the opportunity I had been waiting for. It forced Sterling Global to seek emergency refinancing, which meant the existing debt structures were being unwound and repriced, which created a liquidity moment in which additional debt could be acquired at distressed prices. I moved in the week following the acceleration notice. I acquired the additional positions through 3 separate transactions conducted over 4 business days. The counterparties were a European bank managing distressed asset disposal and 2 domestic hedge funds that had been holding the paper as a workout situation and were relieved to find a buyer willing to move quickly at their asking price. On a Wednesday morning in November, a financial model on my second monitor showed me that Aegis Holdings, through its holding entities, had crossed 51% of the company's outstanding senior debt.
I also held, through a different set of entities, a 19% equity stake in the company's publicly listed preferred shares, enough combined with the debt position to make any restructuring or sale process impossible without my consent. Any bank that wanted to take Sterling Global through a formal workout would need to negotiate with me. Any acquirer who wanted to step in and rescue the company would need to negotiate with me. I owned the table. I sat in my chair in the Hudson Yards office for a long time that Wednesday morning. I turned in my chair and looked at the river, wide and silver in the November light, the New Jersey side cold and industrial on the far bank, and I thought about the rain on 54th Street and the side parlor and the accounts being even. Then I called my attorney and told her to prepare the notifications. I had watched my father's empire for a long time from a distance, tracking every stumble and every misstep with the precision of a scientist measuring decay. I had watched Julian's ambitions exceed his abilities. I had watched Harper's taste run ahead of her judgment. I had watched Richard withdraw into the comfortable distance of a man who believed his legacy was secured. I had been patient for 11 years. I was done being patient. The notifications went out on a Thursday. They were legally precise and financially comprehensive, prepared by my attorney and 2 restructuring specialists and a securities counsel who was very good and who had been told, in terms I made explicit at the outset of our engagement, that discretion was not optional. They arrived at Sterling Global's offices by registered mail, by email, and through their attorneys. The notifications outlined the debt positions held by the various Aegis-affiliated entities, the equity stake, and the formal notification that any restructuring, sale, or recapitalization of Sterling Global Enterprises would require the consent and participation of the majority debt holder. There was a 48-hour news cycle. The financial press had been covering Sterling Global's distress for months, and the emergence of a significant, previously unknown creditor holding majority debt was exactly the kind of development that financial journalists write about with barely contained excitement. The pieces speculated. The creditor was a European distressed debt fund. It was a domestic private equity firm doing a distressed buyout. It was a consortium. No one connected it to Aegis. No one connected it to me. I was contacted by Sterling Global's outside counsel on Friday afternoon. They wanted to schedule a meeting with the principal of the debt-holding entities. I had my attorney confirm availability for the following Tuesday at 10 a.m. at Sterling Global's offices on Park Avenue. I want to tell you that I spent the weekend before that meeting in some kind of profound emotional preparation. I didn't. I worked. I had a company to run, and I ran it. I had dinner with Sandra Akafa on Saturday, who had moved from Harrington to her own fund and who had become, over 10 years, the closest thing I had to a genuine friend in the business world. She didn't know the specifics of what was happening. That's not the kind of conversation I have, but she had a way of looking at me sometimes, reading something in my face that I didn't consciously put there, and saying, "You good?" I told her I was good. On Sunday night, I sat in my apartment, not the Tribeca floor-through anymore. I had moved the previous year to a penthouse in a building on the west side, 22nd floor, with views of the Hudson that on clear mornings looked like a painting, and I laid out what I was going to wear the next Tuesday. A charcoal suit, Italian cut, that I had bought at a price point that I could now afford without thinking about it, and that I still thought about every time I wore it, remembering the $48 dress. My mother's watch, the only thing of hers I possessed, a vintage Cartier that Mrs. Calloway had kept for me for 20 years, handed to me quietly on my 18th birthday, with both hands and wet eyes. Low heels, hair back, nothing that would distract from the face. My father's face, my mother's eyes. I was going to walk in there wearing everything I inherited from both of them. The Sterling Global offices were on the 36th floor of a Park Avenue tower, a space that had been designed in the 1990s to project solidity and permanence, dark wood paneling, a reception desk in marble, the company name in heavy brass letters on the wall. I had been there once, at 16, delivering documents for Mrs. Calloway, who had needed to get a signature from Richard in person. The receptionist at 16 had not known who I was. She had asked me to wait. My father had come out, taken the envelope without looking at me, and gone back inside. The receptionist the following Tuesday was different. She smiled when I came in, offered coffee, told me the meeting room was ready. She had no idea who I was. She thought I was the representative of a creditor fund. I was taken to the main boardroom on the 36th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, a table that seated 18, and around that table when I walked in, Julian, pale and tightly wound in a suit that was slightly too large for the version of himself he was currently occupying. Harper, who had never, in all the years I'd watched her, looked anything but effortlessly composed, and who today looked like someone maintaining composure through sheer force of will, her hands folded on the table in a way that was too still to be natural. 3 attorneys, the CFO, Prescott, with a laptop open and an expression of studied neutrality, 2 board members I recognized from filings, and Richard. He was seated at the head of the table, which told me that whatever degree of operational withdrawal he had made in recent years, he had come back for this. He was 70 years old, and the years were visible in a way they weren't the last time I had been in the same room with him, at his 60th birthday 11 years ago, the night it all began. He was thinner. His hair had gone fully white. His hands, resting on the table, had the slight tremor of a man whose body was no longer entirely reliable. But his eyes were the same, sharp, contained, controlled, the eyes of a man who had built things. He looked up when I walked in, and the look on his face, I had imagined this moment in 1,000 different configurations over 11 years, and I had imagined his expression many ways: shock, anger, contempt. I had not imagined what I actually saw, which was something more devastating than any of those things. It was recognition, immediate, total, absolute recognition, and behind it, the specific horror of a man who has made a calculation he now understands was catastrophically wrong. He knew, in the moment he saw my face, exactly what was happening. I saw him know it, and I watched something go out of him, some foundational certainty, like a load-bearing wall failing in slow motion. "Hello, Richard," I said. The room was very quiet. Julian looked between us. "You know each other?" Neither of us answered him. Richard was looking at me with that expression, the recognition, the horror, and I was looking at him with what I hope was exactly what it felt like to me in that moment. Absolute calm. I sat down. My attorney sat beside me. I opened the folder in front of me, which contained a summary of the debt positions and the proposal I intended to present. "I'll be direct," I said, because those were his words from a side parlor 11 years ago, and I had been saving them. Aegis Holdings, through its affiliated entities, holds 51.4% of Sterling Global's outstanding senior debt and 19% of the publicly listed preferred equity. That position gives us effective control over any restructuring path. The company has been formally notified. Harper had gone very still. Prescott was typing. "The proposal we're presenting today," I continued, "is a full debt-for-equity conversion. The debt is exchanged for a controlling equity interest in Sterling Global Enterprises and its real estate portfolio, including the Hamptons estate and the Manhattan townhouse, both of which are currently pledged as collateral against instruments we hold." "You can't," Julian started. "The documentation is in front of you," my attorney said. "The legal basis is comprehensive. I'm happy to walk through it in whatever detail is useful." I looked at Richard. He was still looking at me. He had not looked away since I walked in. "The second family residence on East 73rd Street," I said, because I had been thorough, because I had made sure every piece of pledged collateral was in that position, "is also within the collateral package. You will have 90 days to arrange alternative housing." Harper made a sound then, not quite a word. Julian put his hand on her arm. "Chloe." Richard's voice was quieter than I remembered it. The authority was there, but underneath it something thinner, something that hadn't been there before. "Whatever you think."
I don't think anything. I know. I know exactly what this company is worth, what its liabilities are, what the real estate portfolio contains, what the debt structure looks like, and what needs to happen to stabilize it. I've known for years. That's why this works. You did this to destroy me. His voice was still steady. I gave him that. No, I said. I did this to own you. There's a difference. You're still here. You still have your name. Sterling Global will continue to operate. It will operate under Aegis's management, and it will be reorganized competently, which means it will survive, which is more than you would have accomplished on your current trajectory. I looked at Julian. I looked at Harper. I held Harper's gaze for a moment, and I said, honestly, I'm not doing this to hurt you. I barely know you. I'm doing this because this is what was built, and what was built is what I came back for. Harper looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. There was anger in it, and something else, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. I stood up, because there was nothing left to do there. The attorneys would manage the rest. The filings were already prepared. The company would pass through a formal restructuring process and emerge 30 days later under Aegis management with the Sterling name intact. I kept the name because the name had value and because I wanted it. I wanted to own it. I wanted the name Sterling attached to something I had built. I want you to understand something, I said, and I was speaking to Richard, only to Richard, the way he had spoken to me in that side parlor on a September night 11 years ago. I didn't do this because I hate you. I did this because you told me on the night of your 60th birthday that I had taken something from you that you could never recover. You told me the accounts were even. I'm here to tell you that they are now. He was looking at me, looking at my mother's eyes and my father's face, and for the first time in my life, the balance of what was in that look had shifted. The grief was still there. It would always be there, but the blame was gone. There was something else in its place that I did not have a name for yet, and I wasn't sure I needed one. I picked up my folder. I looked at him one last time. I'm sorry about my mother, I said. I have always been sorry about my mother. She would have been extraordinary, but I am not the reason she is gone, and I have paid for a crime I didn't commit every single day of my life in that house. I'm done paying. I walked out of the Sterling Global boardroom on a Thursday morning in November, and I took the elevator down 36 floors, and I walked out onto Park Avenue, and the air was cold and the city was loud and enormous and indifferent, the way it always is, the way I have always loved it, and I stood there for exactly 45 seconds. I counted. Then I put in my earbuds, called my assistant to confirm the afternoon schedule, and walked to the next meeting. I had a company to run. The largest assets I now held were a commercial real estate portfolio valued at approximately $900 million and a set of memories that no longer had any power over me. My name is Chloe Sterling. I am the daughter of Richard Sterling and the ghost of Diane Sterling, who died the day I was born, and who I carry in the green of my eyes and the face of a woman my father loved every day of my life. I took nothing from anyone. I built everything I have from the ground up, in the dark, alone, on the fuel of a grief I refused to name and an ambition I refused to limit. My father left me penniless, so I bought his legacy. And if there is a lesson here, and I don't generally believe in lessons, I believe in strategies, it is this. The people who tell you that you are worth nothing are always wrong. They are wrong the way people are wrong when they look at a blank wall and say there is nothing there. They cannot see what is being built in the dark. Build in the dark, keep the receipts, and when the moment comes, walk in with your folder, take your seat at the table, and be precise. That's all it takes. That's everything.